The Christian in Politics. I don't know if I decided to preach this series of sermons at a very weak moment or if I really thought there were some things that I believe we need to hear. And I want to start this way by sharing from three different sources as to why I believe this series of sermons is important for us. When as a nation, we face an election year, and from time to time, I've heard in my life, this is the most important election, and we say that every 4 years. And yet, here we are, and but the Christian in Politics. So on August the 9th of 2022, Pew Research released the results of a pretty in-depth study that they had conducted across our nation. And here are three things that they discovered in their research. Partisan polarization has long been a fact of political life in the United States. So what we're dealing with in this election year really is nothing new. Number two, increasingly, Republicans and Democrats view not just the opposing party, but also the people in that party in a negative light. Growing shares in each party now describe those in the other party as more closed-minded, dishonest, immoral, and unintelligent than other Americans. And then number three, over the past several decades, the share of unattached Americans who express unfavorable opinions of both major parties has grown. In 1994, just 6% of the public had an unfavorable view of the Republican and Democratic parties. Today, 27% have negative views of both parties. A second resource that I'd like to share as we begin this series of sermons comes from a book that was published in 2009 by David Kinnaman and Gabe Lyons, titled Unchristian. This book explores research by the Barna organization in 6 broad themes, the most common points of skepticism and objections raised by outsiders of the Christian faith. Those 6 themes are as follows: hypocritical, too focused on getting targets where people, or converts, where people become targets of conversion. Number 3, anti-homosexual. Number 4, Christians are sheltered. Number 5, Christians are judgmental. And number 6, for our context, Christians are too political. The perception is that Christians are primarily motivated by a political agenda and promote right-wing politics. Now, as they continue to write this book and share information, here is the new perception that Kinnaman and Lyons argue for: that Christians be characterized by respecting people, thinking biblically, and finding solutions to complex issues. Well, even though their information is over a decade old, what they have discovered in more recent studies remain true. And then the final resource that I'd like to share with you, I read, was published just this past week, past Tuesday morning on October 1st. But according to a report from Church Track, millennials, that is, those aged ages 28 through 43 are reportedly turned off by the increasing political polarization in many American churches. Now, there are other resources we could go to which communicate the same kinds of things about Christians and politics. So it's because of some of those attitudes, it's because of the division that many of us experienced in our churches just 4 years ago that we begin this study this morning. So before we get into this morning's lesson, I want to quickly remind you, and you can find these in your bulletin as well as on our social media outlets. But this is where we're headed over the next 4 Sundays after this morning. Next week, we'll look at a word from Jesus. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Synoptic Gospels, all repeat a little phrase, some words of Jesus that are political in nature. In each of those Gospels, Jesus says, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render unto God what is God's." So next Sunday, we will look at that saying from Jesus. 2 weeks from today, we'll have a word from Paul. And we're going to look at Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 7. So I'll remind you again next week of that particular text so you can spend some time wrestling with Paul's words in Romans 13 and see how they might apply to us today. 3 weeks from today, we'll turn to the Apostle Peter. And in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 11 through 17, Peter has some things to say that I believe can help us as Christians when it comes to this topic of politics. And then 4 weeks from today, on the first Sunday of November, just 2 days before the election, we'll have a word about unity. So that's where we're headed over the next several weeks. But our introductory word, I want to begin by sharing 3 kind of traditional approaches to the Christian and politics. And these traditional approaches have been suggested and argued for or against for centuries throughout the whole history of Christianity. And with these 3 traditional approaches, you'll find pros and cons for each approach. And if you do some more research on this particular thing, you'll see that these approaches, in fact, I'm going to illustrate this here in just a moment, might be known by different words or different phrases. But again, somewhat traditionally, in the history of Christianity, these are the 3 approaches to the Christian and politics. The first example I want to share comes from David Lipscomb. How many of us have heard of David Lipscomb? Well, more of you will have heard of David Lipscomb when we complete the winter quarter of our Sunday morning adult classes, because Lynn Franklin will be teaching a class on Restoration history. Now, several weeks ago, I said on my top 10 list of things that people have to do in order to go to heaven, knocking doors was one of those. Well, another thing on that list is every member of the Church of Christ ought to have a course in Restoration history. All right? So you'll learn more about David Lipscomb, I'm sure, in Lynn's class. But in 1866, he addressed this question: who shall govern the world? And he, like others before him and others since, suggested these three traditional approaches. And here is how he phrased those approaches. The first he referred to as conflicting kingdoms. When you think about the church and government entities, two institutions, the Christian and the worldly, were necessarily separate and distinct, that they could form no alliances, that each was necessary in its proper place and for its proper subjects. This was the approach that Lipscomb followed in the latter years of his life and that he argued for very strongly. And in his approach, he did not think a Christian should vote nor hold any kind of public office. And because of Lipscomb's influence, this was the primary approach by the majority of churches of Christ until World War I, and then things changed a little bit. Right? The second approach that Lipscomb discussed, he called institutional. And here's what he meant by that. The church should form alliances with world institutions for the purpose of controlling and using those institutions for the advancement of its own interest. Now, if you think about that, you can see there's some potential dangers with that. And then the third approach he referred to as two kingdoms. Political governments are of divine origin, as such must be supported and sustained for their own intrinsic worth and because they are essential to the well-being not only of the world, but the church itself. So again, those are the approaches that David Lipscomb argued for or shared way back in 1866. And the conflicting kingdoms approach was the one that he kind of pushed, we might say, as his agenda. Well, a more recent categorization of these three approaches has been suggested by Preston Sprinkle. Some of you may be familiar with Sprinkle. Brand new book, about 2 months old, titled Exiles, the Church in the Shadow of the Empire. And he basically takes or suggests, recognizes the same three approaches that Lipscomb identified and others, but he categorizes them or uses different words to describe them. Right? Rather than conflicting kingdoms, as Lipscomb did, Sprinkle uses the word detachment, which emphasizes the church's separateness from society. On the spectrum of political engagement, detachment represents the low end of the spectrum, as little political engagement as possible. The second, Sprinkle refers to as transformation, and it would relate to Lipscomb's approach or suggestion as institutional, all right, kind of a medium approach, which says Christians have a responsibility to bring Christian values to all areas of life and to engage the world in all its dimensions, including the economic, social, and political arenas. And then the third, Sprinkle refers to as prophetic witness, and this would relate to Lipscomb's two kingdoms. But here's what Sprinkle means by prophetic witness. Christ has called his followers to form an alternative political community that lives in contradiction to the world, yet not aloof from it. To be in the world, but not of the world. So, again, I would encourage you to do your own study. Google it up. And again, you'll find these primary traditional approaches that have been suggested, again, argued for and argued against throughout the history of Christianity. But I wanted to share those as we began this series of sermons to kind of help us understand where Christians, at least, may or may not fall on this Christian and politics spectrum. Now, point 2 this morning, we get to do a word study. Surprise, surprise. According to Merriam-Webster.com, the English word politics is borrowed from the Middle French word politique. I'm really good at French. Which means of the state, political, of the regulation of social behavior, which was borrowed from the Latin politicus, which means something like of civil government, political, which was borrowed from the Greek politikos, which means of citizens, made up of citizens, of a statesman, of a state, political, something that's conducted in public. Right? So it's the Greek language from which all of these words actually originate. Words like police, policy, political, politics. And would you believe this word group is found several times in the New Testament? So let me share quickly these various words. And then I want to go back, and I believe 3 of these words in 3 different verses have some theological significance for us as we begin to think about the Christian and politics. The first word, very simply, is polis, which means a population center in contrast to a relatively uninhabited or rural area. In the Greco-Roman world, the term generally implied, now listen to this, to strong political associations, especially in the sense of city-state. So when this word is used in the New Testament, it basically just refers to a city or a town or the inhabitants of a community. But behind it, in the Greco-Roman world, is this political sense, the thought being those who live in a town, those who live in a city-state, are basically of the same political persuasion. A second form of this word only occurs twice in the New Testament, and is found in Acts 17, verses 6 and 8, where Paul and his missionary team are in the city of Thessalonica. And the Jews create some trouble for Paul and his missionary team. And depending on your English translation, the NIV reads city officials. And so this form of the word in Acts 17, verses 6 and 8, refers simply to the government officials, the governing authorities, city officials in the city of Thessalonica. Another word is found in Philippians 3 and verse 20. And in that, we're going to come back to this verse actually here in just a moment. But the word there means something like commonwealth, or maybe in our context in America, a state. We have 50 states. 50 states comprise the United States of America. And it can be used for government, political decision, some kind of course of action. This word could be translated as policy. And again, Paul uses this word in Philippians 3:20, and we'll come back to this word in just a moment. Another word occurs only twice in the New Testament, in Acts 23, verse 1, and Philippians 1 and verse 7. And in some context, it simply means how someone conducts one's life. And that's usually how it's translated in those two verses in the New Testament. Just how we live, our manner of life. But it really means to be a citizen. And of course, the word citizen has some political baggage, if you will, that comes with it. Or it can mean something like to have one's citizenship. The fifth word that we find in the New Testament simply refers to one who lives or comes from a city or country. It can be translated as citizen. It can be used as a compatriot, a member of one's own socio-political group. And in its 1, 2, 3 occurrences in the New Testament, it's more in secular kinds of context and really has no theological significance for us. And then the final word that Paul uses, or the final time we see this word used, Paul does in Ephesians 2 and verse 19, and it's usually translated something like fellow citizen, to be citizens together with someone. And in that context, he's talking to Gentiles who can now be fellow citizens with Jews in Christ. So there is some theological significance there. But I want to go back to one use of polis, or city, and then look at Philippians 1:27 as well as Philippians 3:20, right? To see, again, some things from Scripture where political words are used which emphasize our behavior as Christians. The first is Matthew chapter 5, and we're going to look at verse 14 here in just a moment. You'll recognize that Matthew chapter 5 is the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. And after listing the Beatitudes, Jesus then begins to talk about the influence that his disciples are to have in the world. And we typically say he uses two metaphors, but in reality, he uses three. He says, you are the salt of the earth. And then he says, you are the light of the world. So there are two metaphors. But then in verse 14, we find this word polis. And it reads, a town or a city built on a hill cannot be hidden. Now, he uses it in reference to the light metaphor, but in reality, it kind of becomes its own metaphor. So there are a couple of things I want us to think about from this metaphor of being a city. Remembering that the term in the Greco-Roman world implied strong political associations, especially in the sense of a city-state. So, a couple of things. When Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth, and you are the light of the world, the you there is emphatic. It's at the first of both of those sentences. And it's as if Jesus is saying, you and you only are the salt of the earth. You and you only are the light of the world. You and you only are a city that is sitting on top of a hill, and it cannot be hidden. Well, what does that suggest? We have an awesome responsibility as disciples of Jesus. And we need to assume that responsibility and be what Jesus says we are. Salt and light. And this city-state, this political entity, if you will, as the church, as disciples of Jesus. We are not to be hidden. So our Christian lives are designed to be lived publicly. Our Christian lives are to be lived in such a way that we have an impact. So, salt's a pretty powerful, is it a spice? A seasoning? Yeah. Okay. We know if our French fries don't have any salt, right? We also know when our French fries have too much salt. And we all need light. We all need light to live, to exist, to do things. And aren't we thankful for the modern conveniences of light? Just put on a switch. We understand that importance. But like salt, we can have too much light. We can be blinded by lights. We're driving at night and the car approaching us has their bright lights on and it affects our vision. Right? And so in relationship to that light, Jesus says, you are a city. You're like a city that's on top of a hill. You can't hide that city. And so our lives are to be lived publicly. And in that sense, our lives are political. And as people see us living our Christian life, it's to be analyzed. It's to be seen as different or unique. And it's designed to have an impact upon those who are without Jesus. Let's turn to Philippians 1 and verse 27. And here is an example of New Testament translations just kind of focusing upon the conduct or way of life aspect of this word. Again, remember, it's a part of the politic family. All right? And so most English translations, like the NIV I'm about to read, kind of avoid this political background of this particular word. Simply says, whatever happens, conduct yourselves. There's our word. Conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. So, a more literal or more technical kind of translation would read something like this: whatever happens, be a citizen. A citizen of what? Of that city state, the church, a part of God's people. Right? Be a citizen, to live as citizens and live that Christian life in the public sphere where, again, it's consistent with the gospel and people can see that. People can recognize that. And then, real quickly, just turn a couple of chapters over to Philippians chapter 3 and verse 20. Now, most of our English translations do pick up on the politikos background. Right? For example, the NIV reads, but our citizenship is in heaven. Right? And again, the idea here is that of a commonwealth. And it implies the sense of being an active group of constituents. I mean, we are in this together. Again, we're a part of the same city-state. Right? God has not left us alone on an island somewhere to live out our Christian lives. He's given us each other. That's a good thing. Right? Somebody's supposed to amen that. Thank you. All right. It has the idea, this word, of an ethnic group living in a foreign country. It emphasizes unity as a group set apart from other groups. And so it's intentional that Paul says our. He doesn't say my, he says our citizenship, our commonwealth. All right? It's not in relationship, in Paul's context, to Rome, but our heavenly citizenship. Peter's going to have more to say about this in 1 Peter 2, right? Where he's going to refer to us as foreigners and exiles. Right? But that's 3 Sundays from now. Okay? So in saying this, what Paul is saying, our heavenly citizenship excludes that longing for status in our own society. Because we know who we are. Right? We need no other status than the name of our Lord. Remember a few weeks ago? Christian. One who belongs to Christ. Right? So, the church, individual Christians, there is politics, there are politics in our background. I mean, you could even make the case that the word church is a political term. It's used quite regularly in the Greco-Roman world of those who have been called together in a public assembly to make some kind of political decision. Okay? So, to conclude this morning, let's see. 8 points to ponder as this sermon series has begun. Am I in trouble yet? Okay, good. All right. So, number one, chill. Chill. If the sun doesn't rise on Wednesday morning, November the 6th, we're all going to be in a better place anyway. Right? Right? Okay. All right. So, is it an important election? Every election is important. Right? Will certain candidates go into office who will then pass certain laws that may or may not affect our lives? Absolutely. Right? But if our candidate doesn't win, it's not the end of the world. And again, if it is, we're in a better place. I mean, so let's chill. I mean, after all, we're a part of the SEC. I mean, come on. Number two, engage as your conscience dictates. And we've got to learn, and this is the final lesson on some sermon on in this series on unity. All right, but we have to respect each other's own political views, our own individual consciences, in how we may or may not respond to political things. Right? Now, I can't tell you how to believe. I can tell you what to believe, but I can't tell you how to believe or whether you're going to believe it or not. That's up to you. Right? But I hope one thing we've seen this morning from our quick survey, if you will, in an introductory kind of way, there is a place for us to be involved as God's people. All right? But we may choose to engage ourselves in a way that is different from someone sitting next to you this morning or someone sitting on the other side of the auditorium. All right? So let's respect that. All right? Number 3, don't be a conspiracy theorist unless it's the NBA, the National Basketball Association. I'm at the top of the list as a conspiracy theorist when it comes to the NBA. But that's a different discussion. Let's go drink coffee, all right? A conspiracy theorist is a person who believes that some secret but influential organization is responsible for a particular event or phenomenon. All right? So let's not go down that road. Let's not go down that road. In one way we can avoid that is number 4, avoid extremes in your media consumption. All right? Don't just consume all the way over here, or don't consume all the way over here. Try to be balanced. There's something healthy about a balanced diet, right? Thank you. Number 5, we must be careful that our behavior when it comes to political issues does not jeopardize our mission. And Pew Research, Unchristian, and Church Tract at least should cause us to really think about this particular point. That was of utmost importance to Paul. He could have followed his fellow Jewish zealots into their campaign to overthrow Rome and establish a theocratic empire in Jerusalem, but guess what? He didn't. He conceded to Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, that ensured the spread of the gospel. Our behavior matters. It matters. Number 6, apply Psalm 37, verse 3. It's one of my memory verses. The minute I wake up in the morning, this verse pops into my head. Trust in the Lord and do good. Live in the land and feed on truthfulness. That's pretty good advice. Trust in the Lord. Be serious about doing good to your fellow man. Live in the land. Dwell in the land. And feed yourself on truthfulness. And contextually, guess whose truthfulness the psalmist is talking about? God's truth. Right? Number 7, don't confuse American values with Christian values. They may or may not always match. And then finally, and I've already kind of made this point, but there will be differences of opinion in these matters. Right? Christian politics in the introductory word. Are we so separate from the world that we cannot make any difference? Are we so much like the world, there is not enough difference to make an impact? Or are we so abhorrent to the world that we have no influence? Jesus said, you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. You're a city on top of a hill that cannot be hidden. Let's be who Jesus says we are.